Chapter 3. And now for the most original costume of the day. The next night, I turned my mother's old beach hat into part of my Flenser suit. Mom didn't mind because she'd worn the hat for 4 years and was getting tired of it. My mother never sets foot on the beach without wearing a floppy hat. She thinks it's very bad to get sun on her face. She's always saying that sun makes wrinkles and wrinkles make people look older, and that someday I will know what she means. My father doesn't worry about wrinkles, so he never has to wear anything on his head. I'll be like him when I grow up. How can you dive under the waves with a floppy hat on your head? I look much older in the beach hat. I could pass for 12, I think. Maybe even 13 with sunglasses. The beach hat is so big, it covers most of my face. It used to be lots of different colors, but now it's faded into a kind of bluish gray. I tried to find pictures of whales to decorate the hat, but I couldn't, so I settled for some dolphins instead. I cut them out and stapled them all over the brim. When I cut a piece of black construction paper into thin strips and attached them to it, they hung down the sides, kind of like hair. I shaped my Flenser knife like a sword, but with a big curl at the end. I covered it with gold sparkle and painted my boots to match. I tried on my whole costume. I went to my mother's room to have a look in her long mirror, but Kenny was already there, admiring himself in the witch's suit. He had on his yellow goggles, and the fake cigar dangled out of the corner of his mouth. He was doing some strange dance, but as soon as he saw me, he stopped. "Yeah, I just wanted to see if it fit okay," he said. He walked away from the mirror, tripping over the pointy witch's shoes. "It's hard to walk in these things," he told me, kicking them off. "Can I ask you a very simple question?" I said. "Go ahead." "Why are you wearing your goggles?" "If you have to ask, you wouldn't understand," Kenny told me. "But speaking of goggles, did you know that the first motorcycle race was in France in 1897? "No, I didn't, but thanks for telling me." Kenny looked me up and down. "Is that what you're wearing tomorrow?" "Yes, it's my Flenser suit." I stood in front of the mirror and held the sword out. "What'd you do to your boots?" "Painted them." "Gold?" "Why not?" "Does Mom know?" "They're my boots, Kenny. Why should Mom care if I had to paint them to match my sword?" "Speaking of swords," Kenny began. "We were not speaking of swords," I told him. "We were speaking about my Flenser suit." "Yeah, well, if I were you, I'd wear a sign telling people what you are, because I don't think anybody's going to know otherwise." "Oh, Kenny, you are so dumb. Of course they'll know. Just look at my hat. Can't you see all the pictures of whales up there?" "They're dolphins," Kenny said. "Only you would know that." "And speaking of dolphins," Kenny said, never mind, I don't want to hear it." Later, I made a sign saying Flenser, just in case Kenny was right. I punched 2 holes in it, ran a string and hung it around my neck. The next morning, my mother was surprised when she saw my boots. "They're gold," Mom said in a very loud voice. She puffed hard on her cigarette. "Smoking causes cancer and heart disease," I told her, ignoring my boots. Mom mashed her cigarette out and reached for her coffee. "What did you do to your new boots, Jill?" "I painted them." "Jill, they have to last you all winter. You haven't even worn them yet." "I know it, Mother." "Well, how could you do such a thing?" "A Flenser wouldn't wear plain brown boots." "I just hope you used washable paint." "I think I did." "You checked first, didn't you?" "I'm almost sure it's washable." "You didn't check before you used it?" "Not exactly." Mom lit another cigarette. I called for Tracy. She was in her Big Bird costume, and her mom was adjusting a crown of feathers on her head. "How do you like it?" she asked, twirling around. "Oh, Tracy, you look fantastic." Next to her, I felt very plain. Tracy looked me over. "What's a Flenser?" she asked, reading my sign. "That's what I'm supposed to be," I told her. "I know, but what is one?" "Oh, a Flenser's a guy who strips the blubber off whales." "Where'd you get such a weird idea?" Tracy asked. "From Linda Fisher." You know, the one Wendy calls Blubber? She gave a report on whales. Well, Tracy said, at least you don't have to worry that everyone will be dressed like you. She went to the mirror and combed her hair. She has the nicest hair I've ever seen. It hangs straight down her back. She can even sit on it. And it never looks dirty or has tangles. I'm growing mine, but no matter how long it gets, it will never look like Tracy's. Mrs. Wu drove us to school so Tracy wouldn't mess up her costume. When I got to my class, Wendy was already there. She was dressed like a queen. She wore a very high crown with lots of fake emeralds and rubies pasted to it. She also wore her mother's long bathrobe and had this crazy-looking fur thing wrapped around her neck. It had eyes, paws, a tail, everything. Animals are for loving, not for wearing, I told her. I know it, Wendy said, but this thing is very old. It belonged to my grandmother. And in those days, they didn't know about ecology. Oh, I said, then I guess it's all right. Donna Davidson really fooled me. Instead of dressing like a horse, this year she was a jockey. My things are all genuine, she bragged. My father knows this jockey who's very famous, and he's just my size, and these are his real-life jockey clothes. Donna looked pretty good, but I didn't tell her I thought so. And I wasn't worried about winning the prize for most original costume because a flencer is a lot more clever than a jockey or a queen with a tall crown. Practically everyone else in our class was dressed like a bum, with old baggy pants and shirts hanging out and charcoal smudges on their faces. Caroline even carried a stick with a pouch tied on one end. There is nothing very original about dressing up like that. Right after Mrs. Minish took the attendance, she told us to line up for the Halloween assembly. Remember, no talking in the halls or the auditorium. I stood on line between Wendy and Linda, who was wearing a long red cape. As we walked down the hall, Linda tapped me and said, "What are you supposed to be?" "Can't you read?" I asked, holding up my sign. "Oh, a flencer? I bet you got that idea from my report. What makes you think so?" "Jailbrenner," Mrs. Minich snapped. "I said no talking." In the auditorium, our class sat in the third and fourth rows. I whispered to Linda, "What are you supposed to be?" "Never mind." "Don't you know?" "I know." "Then tell me." "No, it's my own business." "I'll bet you're supposed to be Little Red Riding Hood." "I am not." I turned to Wendy. "Get a load of Little Red Riding Hood," I said. Wendy leaned across to me and told Linda, "You better watch out for the big bad wolf." "Yeah," I said, "you better." And I felt a hand on my head. I turned around in my seat. It was Mrs. Minish. "If I have to speak to you again, you'll go back to the classroom." I didn't say a word during the Pledge of Allegiance or the Star-Spangled Banner. Linda sang in a very loud voice, and when I looked at her, I could see her gray tooth. Wendy says if she isn't more careful about the way she brushes all her teeth will turn gray and rotten and fall out. The Halloween parade was next. Every class had a turn to march across the stage. The costume judges all sat in the first row. They were mothers from the PTA. It's against the rules for them to vote for their own kids. I watched carefully as the other classes had their turns. I pretended to be a judge. Only 2 sixth graders were dressed as anything besides bums. Jerry Pochuck was a doctor, and Fred Yarmouth was something I couldn't figure out. I certainly didn't see any costumes as original as mine, or any that were prettier than Tracy's. After the parade, Mrs. Runyon, the librarian, stood on the stage and said, "I'm happy to be here today to present the prizes for the most beautiful and the most original costumes." I sat on my hands to keep from chewing my nails. "But before I do, I want to share with you the fine prizes the PTA has selected and donated." Mrs. Runyon held up 2 paper books. They both had medals printed on the covers. I read them last year. One wasn't too bad, but the other was so boring, I never got past the first chapter. Still, it wasn't the prize that mattered. It was the idea of winning. "And now for our winners," Mrs. Runyon said. "For the most beautiful costume, Tracy Wu, the Big Bird." Everyone clapped as Tracy ran to the stage, dripping yellow feathers all over the aisle. She got the boring book. "And now for the most original costume of the day." I sat up in my seat. "To Fred Yarmouth, the fried egg," Mrs. Runyon called. I couldn't believe it! I was so sure the prize would be mine. And how did the judges know Fred was supposed to be a fried egg when I had no idea what he was? Fred ran to the stage. Mrs. Runyon said, Tell us, Fred, how did you decide to be a fried egg? I don't know. Fred said, I had this white sheet and some yellow felt, and when I put it all together, that's what it looked like to me. He hadn't even planned to be an egg. That made everything worse. Now I'd be stuck wearing gold boots for the rest of the year. All for nothing.